Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvina Vaditamastu Mavidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. May the Divine Being look over us lovingly as a mother and father. May the Divine Being support and nourish us as a mother and father. May we have the strength and skill to study together the art of spirituality. May no misunderstandings arise amongst us. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto thee, unto us, and to all beloved beings everywhere. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday evening study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. It is a joyous occasion to gather in this way and study the life of the Master, especially when our reader is Haima Naidu, who reads so capably and with such grasp of what it is that she's reading. So before we begin, is there anything from any previous session or anything that you would just like to bring up about spiritual life? Any question, concern, or comment from your own wisdom or experience? All right, dears. We have a nice gathering this evening. I'm so glad to see you all here. Thank you for joining us. So, Haima, if you will tell us where we are.
Okay.
And what it is that we're reading.
Sure, Brother Shankara.
Let us proceed.
Good evening and namaste, everybody. And we are on page 64, the last paragraph I'm going to start. It's on PDF 64. I think the book might be slowly differ 8 pages backwards or something. I'm going to start at one day. We're talking about Narendra since last Tuesday. So this is still about Narendra. That is Swami Vivekananda. One day, soon after,
Narendra had not yet become Swami Vivekananda.
Right. That's right.
He was still a student of the Master at the time that we're hearing about now.
Exactly.
Thank you, Haima.
Sure, Brother Shankara. One day, soon after, Narendra requested Sri Ramakrishna to pray to the Divine Mother to remove his poverty. Sri Ramakrishna bade him pray to her himself, for she would certainly listen to his prayer. Narendra entered the shrine of Kali. As he stood before the image of the mother, he beheld her as a living goddess, ready to give wisdom and liberation. Unable to ask her for petty worldly things, he prayed only for knowledge and renunciation, love and liberation. The Master rebuked him for his failure to ask the Divine Mother to remove his poverty and send him back to the temple. But Narendra, standing in her presence, again forgot the purpose of his coming. Thrice he went to the temple at the bidding of the Master, and thrice he returned, having forgotten in her presence why he had come. He was wondering about it when it suddenly flashed in his mind that this was all the work of Sri Ramakrishna. So now he asked the Master himself to remove his poverty and was assured that his family would not lack simple food and clothing. This was a very rich and significant experience for Narendra. It taught him that Shakti, the divine power, cannot be ignored in the world, and that in the relative plane, the need of worshipping a personal God is imperative. Sri Ramakrishna was overjoyed with the conversion. The next day, sitting almost on Narendra's lap, he said to a devotee, pointing first to himself, then to Narendra, I see, I am this and again that. Really, I feel no difference. A stick floating in the Ganges seems to divide the water, but in reality, the water is one. Do you see my point? Well, whatever is the mother, isn't that so? In later years, Narendra would say, Sri Ramakrishna was the only person who, from the time he met me, believed in me uniformly throughout.
Now let us all get this point.
Sure.
The master said that there was no difference between him and Narendra, that a stick floating in the Ganges appeared to divide the water, but in fact it is only one water, the stick simply floating on the surface, that it is only the mother. And this is true of us just as much as it is true of Narendra and the master. And this is why it's so important for us to contemplate what it means for us to be the divine being. And this is one of the great benefits, one of the great auspicious aspects of studying the gospel, is slowly and slowly this gets brought home to us. Over and over again, the master says, God alone is the doer. God alone is real. All else is illusory. What does he mean by illusory? It means that it arises and passes away. It does not meet the test of being eternal, changeless, infinite, which is the definition within this lineage, this tradition, the definition of what is real. Now you are, in your essence, real, capital R, real. Your being, the true being of your being, the Atman or Brahman, is infinite, eternal, changeless. We come to realize this only through spiritual practice and through hearing such as we have just heard from the Master. Any comments, concerns, or questions about anything that was just read or anything that was said about it? All right, dear, please read on.
In later years, Narendra would say, Sri Ramakrishna was the only person who, from the time he met me, believed in me uniformly throughout. Even my mother and brothers did not. It was his unwavering trust and love for me that bound me to him forever. He alone knew how to love. Worldly people only make a show of love for selfish ends. That's the end about Narendra. End of the whole.
So notice how it ends.
Yes.
Is that about love again?
Yes. You want me to read that one more time, Brother Shankara?
The last few sentences about love.
Okay. In later years, Narendra would say, Sri Ramakrishna was the only person who, from the time he met me, believed in me uniformly throughout. Even my mother and brothers did not. It was his unwavering trust and love for me that bound me to him forever. He alone knew how to love. Worldly people only make a show of love for selfish ends.
But this need not be true of us, though we see the tendency in ourselves to make a show of love for selfish ends. We see it. Certainly, all of us have been, you can say, guilty of that at some point. But if we go beneath the need for selfish ends, which are always worldly ends, there are no such thing as selfish ends in spiritual life, even though we may want the highest for ourselves. It's not selfish. It is selfless in the sense that we're not asking for the small self. We're asking to realize the great or greater self. So we can manifest in that same way that love for one another. And you see it occasionally in human beings. They'll do something so loving and selfless. We can all think of instances in our lives, I'm sure. Certainly I can. So, any other comments or questions about any of that as we come to the end of the reading about Narendra, who, as I said, later became Swami Vivekananda, well, many years after Sri Ramakrishna's passing away.
You're right, Brother Shankara. It's not all worldly people make a show for selfish ends. Like Mother Teresa, she was very selfless. So many of people like her, and even our ordinary human beings, some are very selfless.
Yes. Well, of course, the saints, they are
Yes.
known as Mother Teresa was
Mhm.
beatified.
That's right.
These saints are known for
Mhm.
their selflessness. And they're given that gift by the divine in order that they can perform these works that they perform.
You know, this in a way reminds me, have you heard the story about, I guess, you know, he's like a wandering sadhu and he comes and he knocks on the people's door and he asks, can I just stay in the corner? And they're like, well, okay. And then pretty soon he's like, you know, I need a little more room to stretch out, and, you know, and they're like, okay. And then he's like, well, you know, I need this corner to do puja. And they're, oh, okay. And then he's in the garden picking all the vegetables for the puja. And then he's picking all the best flowers. And little by little, the sadhu just takes over. And, you know, and that's the way the spiritual life just unfolds itself. And you know, and I can see in my own self, you know, before I was not really capable of not doing service out of the ego or selfish means, but as it progressed, then you just have an overwhelming desire to be of service purely out of love.
Well said, as usual, Bhagavan does. How nicely said. And the story about the sadhu. Yes, spiritual life will indeed take over from the worldly if we give it space. And notice that the sadhu was relentless. he didn't let up. So first we start with spiritual life just taking a little corner of our awareness. Later it is predominant in our awareness, and the worldly becomes secondary or even tertiary.
Then the you know, the when you realize you're not the doer and the service itself becomes almost ecstatic.
Yes, the joy of service becomes very, very great. Thank you, Bhagavan. Anything else from anyone about that or anything else? All right, dear, please read on.
Okay, Brother Shankara. Now I'm going to read about Tarak, another disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. His name is Taraknath Ghoshal. Tarak, others destined to be monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, came to Dakshineshwar. Taraknath Ghoshal had felt from his boyhood the noble desire to realize God. Keshab and the Brahmo Samaj had attracted him but proved inadequate. In 1882, he first met the master at Ramachandra's house and was astonished to hear him talk about samadhi, a subject which always fascinated his mind. And that evening, he actually saw a manifestation of that super conscious state in the master. Tarak became a frequent visitor at Dakshineshwar and received the master's grace in abundance. The young boy often felt ecstatic fervor in meditation. He also wept profusely while meditating on God. Sri Ramakrishna said to him, God favors those who can weep for him. Tears shed for God wash away the sins of former births. Any
No, repeat that line.
Yes.
Shed for God.
Sri Ramakrishna said to him, God favors those who can weep for him. Tears shed for God wash away the sins of former births. That's the end of Tarak.
So tears shed for God
Yes.
wash away the sins of former births. In other words, they expunge our karma. Don't think that karma is immutable. It is not. If we begin to practice spiritual disciplines and we get into these states where we don't need to physically shed tears. It's of course auspicious if we do, but we can shed tears in the heart. And when we do this, something is shifting. And that which would have been visited on our stardust spacesuit, because that's what experiences the karma, our soul or Atman does not experience karma. There's no associate, there's no karma associated with the Atman. So that which would have been visited on our embodiment will not be visited on. Why not? Well, we no longer need the lesson that karma would have brought to us. Karma is almost always in the form of some kind of lesson, a positive lesson. There's bright karma, where we see, if I pursue sattva in this way, then I will achieve spiritual delights, spiritual heights, or negative karma, dark karma, in which we receive a lesson. But when the sins of former births are washed away, what we would have need to learn so that we did not repeat those sins. The sins, of course, refer to the dark karma. We don't need to repeat those. So this is why it's very good for us to reach deep in ourselves and find this place where there is this emotional relationship with the divine, a profoundly emotional relationship. as Sri Ramakrishna says, in this age, the most auspicious spiritual path is the path of devotion, bhakti, an emotional relationship with the divine. A jnani is not going to shed any tears for God. So it's best for us to have this emotional relationship. Any other comments, questions, or concerns from anyone?
So when it says this, it's talking about weeping out of just sheer love for the divine. And, because I know some people that, they say they weep for the suffering of the world and all that, but that's not what it's talking about here. Is that correct?
Well, it can be if we identify the suffering of the world as the suffering of the only doer of the divine itself. It can be. But for most people, you're right. They don't make that connection. They don't have that connection to make. They've never learned it. So they're weeping for the suffering of the world. Well and good.
Yeah.
And good.
But I would say that probably that person hasn't realized that the nature of suffering, because I just can't believe in the suffering. I see it as Maya, even though I know there's a reality to the rope, but at the same time, it's ephemeral. It's not the Atman.
Well, we have to be careful, Bhagavan Das. Those people who are experiencing the after effects of that earthquake in Morocco, I heard an extensive report on that today on NPR. They are suffering. Their privation, their hunger, their cold. I mean, they are standing in line to be given a blanket so that they wouldn't freeze to death in the cold Atlas Mountains. Winter. I mean, it's coming on winter there, and so they're suffering. So we have to be careful not to minimize this by saying it's Maya. Yes, it's Maya.
I understand that, but I don't suffer myself from the idea of suffering, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, that's good. If you see it in the proper light, you can, through your heartfelt prayer, help alleviate that suffering.
Yeah. I mean, that's where the love of service out of the love of the divine comes in.
And prayer is service. Swami Prabhupada was very clear about this. My teacher, my guru.
So
prayer is service. It has an effect.
You've heard the thing about when the elephant enters a small pond and the pond overflows. But when the elephant enters the ocean, nothing happens. And so when we weep tears for the divine, it's like, we're kind of overflowing the pond, kind of, so to speak. And eventually, does our capacity keep expanding on our ability to feel love for the divine indefinitely?
Yes. And I'm glad you used the word indefinitely. Infinitely. There is no end to our relationship with the divine because it is the relationship with ourself, our higher self. And so this is why we see the saints leave the lower self essentially behind. It isn't that they don't eat and sleep and so on. Of course they do. But it's strictly a matter of process and function. They don't identify with it at all.
I'm sorry, when I see Swami Sarvadevananda, and I believe it's
Atmananda, yes.
when I see him also, I can just tell that their mind is in a higher place.
Nope,
Like
nope.
nobody's home. They're not the doer.
Well, it's because they have become the face of the eternal teacher. They're no longer the human being that took monastic vows and ultimately sannyas vows and became a Swami and grew. They're no longer that. They have become something more. And you've identified two of the stars. Sarvapriyananda is another. Though he's very different, each Swami is different. So yes, you're right. Anything else from anyone?
Namaste, Brother Shankara.
Hello there, Shailesh.
Can you hear me?
Of course, I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, my mic is messed up. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I have little different feelings and thoughts about this whole thing, and I'll just share real quick. So there are two aspects here I'm seeing. One is the suffering, and one is prayer. And they, like Bhagavan Das said, it starts, probably they start at the same place, or even if they do not start at some same place, they do come together at one point where the suffering, you may repent for your own actions, but you also may feel suffering for the others. And my own understanding and my own evolution with my spiritual practice is that we become more sensitive about suffering of others and around us. And just the way we are praying for God, for our own connection with the self, with the higher self, and to understand what's going on in our life, and become more pure and become more inward, turn inwards, and understand the real nature of the world and around us. What happens is that we also open up a channel to see the suffering around us. And this is my own personal experience, not from books or anything. And what happens is that you may get sucked into it. And so, for example, I'll give you, I feed animals, I feed cats, and I look at other wild animals and other places, and I see the immense suffering they go through. And I feel it so much. And so at one point, I was instructed from inside not to spend too much time on that suffering and prayer. And then I started, and it was very clear and blunt instruction which came to me that you can pray and you can suffer for all this around you, but it cannot unhinge you in your spiritual practice. You need to keep going forward. And then I started thinking about it, why this instruction very clearly came to me. And then I realized that this world will go on. And like Bhagavan has mentioned this word Maya, this Maya will go on. What we have to do is we have to pray, we have to be receptive to it, we have to spend time with it, but we also need to let it go and move forward. And it was a relief to me, because then you can go round and round. And I was clearly told that if you go into this, you will go round and round. There is no exit. The path is being shown to you. If you do not walk that path, you're going to go round and round. And so, it comes to the prayer now, that show me the right path and show me the right balance of what I need to do. And then I'll go forward with that. Hold my hand and show me the way. So that's my thoughts here. Thank you.
Very, very well said. And as you said, you can become sensitive enough to where the suffering of others becomes unbearable to you. Of course, it must not consume you. But I'll give you an example from the life of Vivekananda. He had gone to, I believe, Darjeeling. And when he arrived, a great feast was prepared for him. A great amount of food, and many people were invited and so on. Well, there were some poor people, some beggars, and they came to the door, and Vivekananda heard them ask for the water in which the rice had been boiled, so that they would have at least this much nourishment. Vivekananda immediately stood up and said to his host, "Give them all this food." And he left the place. He could not bear their suffering. And he told his host, "All this food that you have prepared for me and your other guests, give it to them." And of course, because it was Vivekananda and this was his disciple, that was what was done. So you're very right, Shailesh. This is very correct, all you've said. And so Vivekananda went ahead with his mission, with his spiritual path. But it didn't mean, and of course, and there were other instances throughout his life where he couldn't hold on to money, for example, when he would make money speaking in New York. You know, he'd make $10 and on a couple of appearances, and that money would be with the person who kept his money, never kept his own. And so, but it would come to his ears that someone was suffering and needed money. And he would tell the person who was keeping the money for them, give them that $10. So compassion is an active thing. Compassion is not just, though it can not be evident if you're simply praying for others, which, as I said, Swami Prabhupada was very emphatically, he very emphatically said that it had a great effect. Why? Because we're not separate. What arises in our heart forcefully has an effect on others, because there is no separation of that stick on the water. The water is one. And so what happens on one, what apparently is one side of the stick, has an effect on the other. So thank you, Shailesh, for all of that. And I didn't see any real difference between what you were saying and what we've been saying. It's just that the emphasis was on your own personal spiritual life and your own spiritual practice, which is where it should be. Thank you, Shailesh. Anything else from anyone?
I just want to make one comment, Brother Shankara. No
Yes.
matter how much suffering and pain we go through, as long as we don't give up the faith in God, He's always there. The divine power is always there to rescue us, and it'll make us move forward. We suffer a little bit, and then we get over it, and then we move forward as if it was a divine test for us. That suffering was a test for us. That our heart purifies and go to higher realms.
Well, I will say, dear, you're right. But I will say that the last few months for
Yes.
me, since the 28th of July, have been some very real pain and suffering.
Yes.
Yes, the divine is always there. Otherwise, I couldn't hold these classes or give the talks on Sunday. It would be hypocritical. The divine is always there. But believe you me, so is the suffering.
That's right.
So is the pain. So is the suffering. And so we mustn't make too light of Maya. We mustn't make too light of the suffering of others. We can deal with our own suffering as nobly as we possibly can. And that's wonderful. So, in any event.
Thank you.
I guess coming from an AA standpoint, I've had sponsees of mine die and seen many of people die in the program. And, but if one of my sponsees goes out and dies, the realization that I'm not the doer, that I dance by the mother's will alone, and that I'm not in charge of the outcome, and I don't suffer that outcome, so to speak. Not
Well said. And that is an excellent example. Yes, it's an excellent example. You did your best for that sponsee. They could not hear everything that you were saying and live their life accordingly. So they went out, they drank or used, and died. You are emphatically not responsible for the outcome. You have, as you said, danced to the mother's tune. Very well said. Thank you. AA is so real, isn't it? I mean, you see what human beings are and can be. They can be so noble and so great and so strong and so sober and such a good sponsor. My son, who is an alcoholic, has a sponsor named Ron. Every time I think of his name, praise comes to my heart. He is a remarkable man. But if my son went out and drank himself to death, Ron would not feel as if he had failed. So thank you. I just wanted you to know how profoundly I understood what I was saying when I said AA is so real. Anyone else? All right, how are we doing for time?
We still have quite a bit of time, 23 minutes at least.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
Good.
we get quite a bit of time. You want me to go on, Brother Shankara?
Please, of course.
Okay. Next is Baburam, another disciple. I'm going to read about him. Baburam Ghosh came to Dakshineshwar accompanied by Rakal, his classmate. The master, as was often his custom, examined the boy's physiognomy and was satisfied about his latent spirituality. At the age of 8, Baburam had thought of leading a life of renunciation in the company of a monk in a hut shut out from the public view by a thick wall of trees. The very sight of the Panchavati awakened in his heart that dream of boyhood. Baburam was tender in body and soul. The master used to say that he was pure to his very bones. One day, Hazra, in his usual mischievous fashion, advised Baburam and some of the other young boys to ask Sri Ramakrishna for some spiritual powers and not waste their life in mere gaiety and merriment. The master, scenting mischief, called Baburam to his side and said, "What can you ask of me? Isn't everything that I have already yours?" "Yes, everything I have earned in the shape of realizations is for the sake of you all. So get rid of the idea of begging, which alienates by creating a distance. Rather, realize your kinship with me and gain the key to all the treasures."
I'll hold up this one.
All the treasures.
Came Swami Premananda and was indeed, Sri Ramakrishna called his disciples. He didn't have that many, fewer than 100. He called them his band of minstrels, particularly those who were in the inner circle. And Baburam was one of the chief minstrels. he really played the master's music and became a remarkable sadhu after the master's death, and they all became monastics, all of those boys that became monastics. Vivekananda was one, of course, Brahmananda another. Tarak became, I've forgotten now what his monastic name was. In any event, these were the master's band of minstrels. So anything else from anyone?
I just think about the people that were able to be in the presence of the actual embodied avatar. And sometimes I wonder if, like, just because of familiarity, they kind of become desensitized to it, whereas if probably most of us were to see him, we would just literally hit the floor like a rag doll, and I'm just like, I just like can't imagine being in
There were some who became, as you said, desensitized. Those tended to be among the householder devotees, and among those householder devotees, they tended to be the ones who drank. They were less sensitive to who it is that they were dealing with. Of course, the star example of this is Girish Ghosh, who was a drunkard and a debauchee, and was one of the master's great triumphs of turning a profound, we would call, sinner into an absolute saint. But he was so insensitive to the master that though it was virtually impossible to do so, he actually managed to hurt the master's feelings by his abuse. And so, as you say, if we were to encounter the master, we would hit the floor like a rag doll. Well, the two Swamis that you mentioned earlier, Sarvadevananda and Yogatmananda, I would venture to say, have in this metaphor, have become that rag doll. They encountered the fullness of the master, which is why they became his face. The master is the eternal teacher. And so when they became a face of the eternal teacher, I certainly heard this from Swami Prabhavananda. He spoke of it as a thunderclap when he first had his full realization of the master's presence. He said it was like a thunderclap. So yes, even such a one as Swami Prabhavananda, such an elevated soul.
Brother Shankara?
Yes, dear.
Hey, it's Vicky. How are you?
Yes, Vicky, I'm so glad to hear your voice.
Thanks. In reference to what Bhagavan Das said, we also have to assume that we would recognize such a person.
Ah, yes.
And also, just because someone doesn't know such a person or isn't aware of such a person right now in the world, that doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Perfectly true. Perfectly true. It's said that Hanuman is always among us. Hanuman always exists. And of course, other saints are there. But Sri Krishna in the Gita, he laments. People walk right by me and don't recognize who I am. And that's all they need to know. That's all they need to know is who I am and what my mission is, and they will attain liberation. He says that in so many words. All they need to know is who I am and why I come, and they will attain liberation. So you're very right, Vicki. And of course, we can look around. Certainly there are some very remarkable examples embodied now that we can look to. Of course, an easy one is the Dalai Lama. But the name Mother Teresa was mentioned. She's no longer with us, of course. But there are other saints. And some, Vivekananda says, these saints, they don't necessarily have to be known for their effect to be felt in the world, whether the world knows it or not. And he gave some specifics, but I won't take us down that path. So thank you, Vicki. Very well said. Very apt.
It wasn't that great, but thank you.
Well, it certainly was. It certainly gestured in a great direction, dear.
Thank you.
Well, don't minimize yourself too much. You hear very well. Anyone else? Anything to say?
The life of the Holy Mother after the Ramakrishna died, and that you look at her family situation, and they really had no or little regard for her as the Holy Mother. And, I guess it just depends on where you are. Like, people that, some people, and even in my own life, I would have been incapable of seeing her as that at one point. And, I guess it's just by grace and auspiciousness that we do or can.
Well, you're right about her family. Many in her family, very few in her family. But they just regarded her as auntie or niece or sister or something like that. They didn't really realize who she was. And it amazed them that all of these wealthy, important people from Calcutta and elsewhere came to bow down and take the dust of her feet when she was there in Jairamati. So some of them ultimately were persuaded, well, she must be somebody very important. But it fell into I won't go down that path of criticizing. But thank you, Bhagavandas, you're right. Would we recognize the Holy Mother if she were in the room with us? Well, we can hope that we would.
Well, I think part of it is once you realize we're all the same being, then you treat everyone with respect.
Well, certainly with respect, but there would be extraordinary feeling for someone like the Holy Mother. But you're right. When we understand we're all that, then we extend our most heartfelt love and affection and respect to everyone as best we can. Anything else before we go on?
I would like to share my own experience or just understanding about seeing a God realized soul and recognizing or not. I met 3 people in my life who were completely full God realized souls. And luckily I'll share this, how I became aware. One was my father's guru, who was a school teacher, but he was a fully realized soul. And I met him when I was about 5 years old. And after that, I kept meeting him. But it took time for me to understand. By the time I was 18 or 19, I realized that he was some extraordinary being. And then I had a good luck of staying with him, knowing him for 7-8 years very closely. And it was, he could predict about certain things about me. He didn't predict or anything, but he was not that kind of a person, just fully established in God. And so he would give me direction and just a little bit, that's how most of these people will work. So that was the first experience I had. Second was my own guru. Actually, before my own guru, Swami Nikhilananda, he was the 12th president of the Ramakrishna order. And I had a very chance of meeting him very, very closely. And 3 days he had come. I was only 19 years old, and he had come to Pune where I was, and I was volunteering. And obviously, first day, I had no idea who he was, and someone told me that he was the president, and I had no idea. And you're a college-going student, you just bump into them. So first 1 or 2 days, I had no idea. Like I saw him very closely, but on the third day, being a volunteer, he gifted me a dhoti in the evening. He called all the volunteers and gifted me a dhoti. And so that was the first time. This was 1991, December of 1991. I still remember very clear. And it was about 6 o'clock in the evening, and I was very close to him. And when I went very close to him, I felt something. And then I took the dhoti and I was hanging around, and the Maharaj said, why don't you eat food and then go? So everybody had gone because it was 3-day function and everybody was tired. So there was no one else. And so, I went and ate in the kitchen, and one of the volunteers who was another boy of my age, now who is a very, very honored and respectable monk now. He was a boy just, and he said, the Guru Maharaj is sitting outside by himself. And I saw, we washed our dishes really quick, and I ended up right at his feet, sitting at his feet. And I sat there, and it was a cold night, and he had finished his food and he had come and sat outside. It was a big recliner, and it was completely dark, and there was just a little bit light, and very remote place, no sound of anything. It was 8:30. And so I sat right at his feet, about 2 feet away. And then obviously there were a couple of others who came. And slowly when I sat, it completely affected my mind. And I felt the time just stopped. Something happened. I had no idea what it was. So, and then, someone said, I think it's time. So we just crawled back, and probably it was 20, 25 minutes or maybe 30 minutes. And then when I left, I was walking to my bicycle. I was riding bicycle, and it was about half a mile walk to my bicycle stand, and then I took that. But he stayed with me for at least a day or two. Next day, he was going to go away, and someone said, he's going, we're going to go to a train station to drop him off. And I said, I didn't go. I felt that. So that was the second experience. And the third experience was the president he was a vice president back then, Swami Ranganathanandaji Maharaj. And luckily, I ended up as his room attendant for 3 days. And that was 92, summer of 92. And same thing, that first 1 or 2 days, I didn't feel anything. I saw him very closely. But after 2 or 3 days spending very close time with him, I felt you could look at his face very closely, 2 feet away, look at his face, and you could feel something extraordinary. So to just wrap up, I would say that it's very difficult unless you see that person closely, or that's my understanding, that if you spend some time and if you're physically close, I think that makes a huge difference. And so my suggestion and my thought is that any big monk, if he comes, it's very nice to be, if you can get a close seat or see them very closely physically, I think that makes an impact. That's how my conclusion is, my understanding is. Thank you.
Thank you, Shailesh. Wonderful stories. Wonderful stories. They allow us to see them. They can disguise themselves from us, or they can allow us to see them. How are we doing for time?
We'll have 6 minutes, Brother Shankara.
All right, unless there's something else from anyone, let's read on.
Okay. Next is Niranjan, another disciple. Oops, sorry, I just lost the page. Hold on 1 second, Brother Shankara. It just skipped. Okay. Sorry about that. I just suddenly, the
It's
PDF
okay.
pulled me to upward, downwards. Okay, I'm coming back. Okay, Niranjan is another disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. We're going to read about him. Nitya Niranjan Sen was a disciple of heroic. He came to the master when he was 18 years old. He was a medium for a group of spiritualists. During his first visit, the master said to him, "My boy, if you think always of ghosts, you will become a ghost. And if you think of God, you will become God. Now, which do you prefer?" Niranjan severed all connections with the spiritualists. During his second visit, the master embraced him and said warmly, "Niranjan, my boy, the days are flitting away. When will you realize God? This life will be in vain if you do not realize Him. When will you devote your mind wholly to God?" Niranjan was surprised to see the master's great anxiety for his spiritual welfare. He was a young man endowed with unusual spiritual parts. He felt disdain for worldly pleasures and was totally guileless like a child. But he had a violent temper. One day, as he was coming in a country boat to Dakshineshwar, some of his fellow passengers began to speak ill of the master. Finding his protest futile, Niranjan began to rock the boat, threatening to sink it in midstream. That silenced the offenders. When he reported the incident to the master, he was rebuked for his inability to curb his anger. That's the end of about Niranjan.
Yes, this is an interesting story.
Very much.
Niranjan became Niranjanananda and a fierce guardian of the master, particularly in the master's last days at Kashipur. The master had to actually, again, rebuke him for being too zealous in protecting the master. But Niranjan, it's a remarkable story if you read this full story, Niranjan. Okay, please read on, dear.
Sure. Next is Jogindra, another disciple. Jogindranath, on the other hand, was gentle to a fault. One day, under circumstances very like those that had evoked Niranjan's anger, he curbed his temper and held his peace instead of threatening Sri Ramakrishna's abusers. The master, learning of his conduct, scolded him roundly. Thus, to each, the fault of the other was recommended as a virtue. The Guru was striving to develop, in the first instance, composure, and in the second, mettle. The secret of his training was to build up by a tactful recognition of the requirements of each given case, the character of the devotee. Jogindranath came of an aristocratic Brahmin family of Dakshineshwar. His father and relatives shared the popular mistrust of Sri Ramakrishna's sanity. At a very early age, the boy developed religious tendencies, spending 2 or 3 hours daily in meditation, and his meeting with Sri Ramakrishna deepened his desire for the realization of God. He had a perfect horror of marriage, but at the earnest request of his mother, he had to yield, and he now believed that his spiritual future was doomed. So he kept himself away from the master So he kept himself away from the master. Sri Ramakrishna employed a ruse to bring Jogindra to him. As soon as the disciple entered the room, the master rushed forward to meet the young man. Catching hold of the disciple's hand, he said, "What if you have married? Haven't I too married? What is there to be afraid of in that?" Touching his own chest, he said, "If this is propitious, then even 100,000 marriages cannot injure you. If you desire to lead a householder's life, then bring your wife here one day, and I shall see that she becomes a real companion in your spiritual progress. But if you want to lead a monastic life, then I shall eat up your attachment to the world." Jogin was dumbfounded at these words. He received new strength, and his spirit of renunciation was re-established. That's the end of Jogindra, and our time is up, Brother Shankara. We can go we can go back and read again this one if you want to.
Well,
Later, next week.
as pleases yourself, dear, I think that might be a nice idea.
Okay.
We'll have a chance to discuss it a little.
Yes.
So is there any final thought or concern or question from anyone about anything we've read or said, or about anything else having to do with spiritual life? All right, dears. Jai Shri Guru Maharaj Ji Ki Jai. Jai Shri Guru Maharaj Ji Ki Jai. Durga, Durga, Durga. May we be safe. May we all be healthy. May we all be cheerful. May we all have peace of mind. And may we all go forward, secure in the knowledge that we are in the loving and protective embrace of the Divine Being as our Mother and Father. May we all be well and in bright spirits. And so with that, unless there's something else from anyone, I'll sign us off.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you all, dear. Good night.
Night.
Good night.